My name is Dan Gilling. I've been a long-time colleague and hopefully also friend of Zoe's, most recently in the School of Society and Culture. In the past, Zoe's been my line manager, and I've been Zoe's line manager, and we're still talking to each other. So I'm delighted to have been asked by Zoe to make this introduction, and assuming it wasn't because you couldn't find anybody else, for me it says a couple of things. Firstly, it tells me that we go back an awful long way together, in fact back into the last century. And we've been together through our journeys at Plymouth, but also in more exotic locations from time to time. Particularly memorable for me was our cultural turn in Bologna. But also, we took the injunction of Robert Park to go and get the seats of our pants dirty and do some gritty urban ethnography in Amsterdam. And rather like the 60s, if you say you remember it, you weren't there. Secondly, also suggests that she may have forgiven me for having the dubious distinction of being the only member of the appointments panel who didn't put her first place when she applied for a post here some years ago. I'm happy to admit now that I was wrong. So on to this evening, and obviously the award of a chair and the opportunity to be called and to call yourself a professor is a high point in any academic career, and this is the achievement that we're recognising through this event this evening. To attain that recognition, there have been many other achievements that Zoe's chalked up along the way, and she's evidenced in her case for promotion. So we see, for example, the hundreds of thousands of pounds in research funding that Zoe's won, and the documented impact of the research that extends into the real world and beyond these ivory towers. We see the conference presentations and the conferences she organises and attends over the years, including the very successful and prestigious International British Society of Criminology Conference, which was held here at Plymouth and honestly wouldn't have taken place without Zoe's effort. Then there are the academic and external stakeholder networks that she's formed or joined and further extended, helping to raise the profile of her subject area and of her own work internationally as well as nationally. And of course, there are several books and chapters and journal articles that you've written and that evidence your standing in the field and that have been read by dozens of people. Such is the lot of the 21st century academic. Whilst it's important that we recognise those academic achievements, I'd like to say something about the manner of the achievement, which has included having to deal with more than a fair share of adversity along the way. It won't come as a surprise to this audience that academia probably has more than its fair share of big egos whose successes can be built on the unrecognised hard graft of others who make their successes possible. I'm pleased to say that's not Zoe. Zoe's not like that. Rather, what I'd want to emphasise is three positive qualities that for me mark out her success. And the first of those is the time that she has for other people. That particularly includes her undergraduate and postgraduate research students who've benefited enormously from her support, her guidance, and her advice. But it also includes the time she has for her colleagues. And there are several academics, including those sitting here today, who have been the beneficiaries of her support and mentoring, and she should be saluted for that. Secondly, there's her role as a team player and a team leader. At one point, the cohesiveness of the criminology team was the envy of many, and this was due in no small part to Zoe's role in keeping the team together. That meant, among other things, being prepared to muck in, teaching subjects that sometimes lay outside her comfort zone, but nevertheless they needed covering to keep the show on the road and to develop, extend, and update our programs and their curricula. It also meant advocating for the subject area within the university, for a subject area that hasn't always been well supported or understood as it might have been, despite the number of students that it continues to attract. Criminology at Plymouth is a success in no small part because of the role Zoe has played in making it so. And thirdly, and perhaps most pertinent for this event, in my view, Zoe's academic work constitutes what I would call proper sociological criminology. And that means two things in particular. Firstly, it's built on strong empirical foundations without being empiricist. As a criminologist, whether she likes it or not, Zoe takes much of her subject matter from the definitions of the powerful, but she draws upon solid social analysis, she interweaves theory and method, and she produces meaningful research that speaks truth to power, even though, unfortunately, power isn't always listening. And secondly, she does this with a strong commitment to an ethic of care and regard for her research subjects, Gypsies and travellers in particular, thereby definitively and decisively answering the sociologist Howard Becker's famous call for us to consider that central but often misunderstood question of social analysis: whose side are we on? This evening, despite the likelihood I'll probably disagree with everything you say, I'm very much on Zoe's side. And without further ado, therefore, I invite Zoe to present her inaugural. Zoe, happy inaugural. Now get on with the work.
Okay. Right, I want to cry already. When reflecting on how I would go about this inaugural lecture, I was most patently aware of the fact that the audience I'm talking to is extremely varied. As a public lecture, I want this lecture to serve to inform people who may not know about the ill treatment of Gypsies, travellers and Roma, and how I, as a criminologist, can illuminate your understanding in an accessible and relevant way. As a lecture to my colleagues who work in criminology and hate studies, I want this lecture not to bore you too much, as you've heard this from me many times before. As a lecture to my family and friends, I want to let you know what I've been doing all the time and why I care so much about it. Most importantly, for those people from Gypsy, traveller or Roma communities, I want to report what I have been told in a way that effectively represents your experiences. I don't have Gypsy, traveller or Roma heritage, and I see my role as simply a placeholder for people from those communities to fill. Gypsies, travellers and Roma have notoriously poor access to education or are pushed out of education because of bullying from peers and poor treatment from teachers and school officials. Things are changing, and Gypsies, travellers and Roma are increasingly fighting for their space in education. One of the proudest moments of my career thus far was to externally examine the PhD of Cindy Joyce at the University of Limerick in Ireland, who was the first traveller in Ireland to graduate with a PhD, and who recently took up a post as a lecturer in traveller studies at that university. An initiative to enable access to higher education for Gypsies, Roma, travellers, boaters and show people is currently being led by academics at Bucks New University, not least by Margaret Greenfield, who has been a leader in many areas of research in support of Gypsies, travellers and Roma over the years. Indeed, Margaret has inspired aspects of my own work, especially on ensuring accommodation provision for Gypsies and travellers. So, Gypsies, travellers and Roma will soon be stood where I am, but I hope that they will tell a different story. My intention today is to talk about hate and how hate has impacted on all aspects of the lives of Gypsies, travellers and Roma. My mum, sitting before me now, would say that hate is a very strong word, and indeed it is. Myself and my colleagues in hate studies use the term hate purposely to evoke emotion and to represent the feelings of those who are subject to its vagaries. Having an intense dislike for somebody because they are a gypsy, traveller or Roma is a problem we need to think about very carefully. Just to give you a general idea of what I'm referring to, in 2017 and 2018, research studies found that general public perceptions of gypsies, travellers and Roma in the UK were hostile. And in 2014, the Global Attitude Survey found that 50% of UK respondents held negative views of gypsies, travellers and Roma. These negative views and attitudes have their roots in biologically determined perceptions of who is valuable in society and who is not. In other words, we have to appreciate that racism has built these perceptions and plays an important part in sustaining them. Or do what it's supposed to do. Oh, I turned it off. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, how did I get here? To stand before you as a professor. It's baffling to me. And in order to prepare for this lecture, I've attempted to traverse my journey from a teenager with a bad attitude, or so my teachers told me, to where I am now. Interestingly, the bad attitude, or tendency to challenge people, has probably been the key to my academic development throughout my career. Needless to say, I failed my exams at school, and I did not respond well to secondary school teachers who told me what to think and say. I had one wonderful teacher, Mrs. Simmons, who taught us English literature. She made it interesting by allowing our imaginations to run free and by taking seriously our arguments. I've just got to get my glass of water, sorry. I gained a lot from school, but not a lot of qualifications. Mostly I gained friends for life, some of whom are here now. We were rebellious and silly, worried about boys more than books, and ultimately left school with very few O-levels or A-levels between us. Interestingly though, those rebellious girls are now women who have between them numerous degrees, varied careers, and are wonderful, interesting and caring humans. Clearly there was nothing wrong with them, but with the schooling system that didn't embrace them. Having now watched my son go through education, I find it fascinating to see history repeating itself. Not that Rex is a rebel in any way, he did brilliantly at school and at university. But I watched him having his imagination stifled by secondary school too. And it was only because he was lucky enough to have people around him that had the time, energy and wisdom to listen to him that he wasn't negatively affected by school. It is a sad situation to find ourselves in, that at universities, educators are trying to open minds, challenge existing knowledge, and create new ways of understanding the world, while at school, especially secondary school, kids are told what to think, what answers to give, what will pass the test. As university lecturers, we have to spend a lot of our time deprogramming young people, allowing their imaginations to run free. Now, please, don't get me wrong. I know there are some wonderful teachers out there, but they are restricted in what they can do. They are tied to performance indicators that pressure them to produce results. I don't have time to get into a critique of contemporary teaching agendas, and universities are now places that are likewise dominated by similarly problematic measures of success. But my colleagues at Plymouth and those I work with around the UK and the world hold firm to academic freedom. The benefit to society as a whole of developing new ideas and new knowledge to move us forward as societies. I was lucky. I left school with very limited skills other than to argue back, which I haven't lost. I did some jobs, cleaned offices, worked in a florist delivering flowers, stories about which my boyfriend and son love to hear. I was fired from a photography shop at 20. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do. I went to a careers service confident I could do something good, but not sure what. They introduced me to an access course, and my future was sealed. I had a wonderful year studying politics, sociology, English literature, and French contemporary studies, I'll tell you what that is later, on my access course, in a space where debate was encouraged and there were no set texts. I could read what I wanted and explore ideas. It was wonderful. I was then accepted to the University of Surrey for my undergraduate degree in applied sociology. It was still during the time when you got a grant to go to university. It was amazing. What I learned on my degree gave me the academic grounding I have drawn on throughout my career. How to carry out good research, how to be brave in research, and how to use my imagination in partnership with existing knowledge. University was a space where I was given the opportunity to flourish, to be myself, argue a point, develop ideas, and appreciate how the social world functions. Oh, no, there you go. I'm really good with the tech. My degree also gave me the opportunity to work at the Home Office as a researcher for a placement year. And that is where I began my journey as a criminologist. I met my now friend and colleague, Coretta Phillips, who taught me how to turn my learning into practical research. I worked with Coretta on a project that changed my view of the world. We researched what happened to people as they travelled through the criminal justice process. We clearly identified that race was a predictor of what happened to people when they went through the system, whether they were stopped and searched, whether they were arrested, what bail decisions were made, and whether they were charged by the police, as well as whether their case was proceeded with by the Crown Prosecution Service. Another project I worked on during my time at the Home Office was a research study into the public order provisions of newly passed legislation, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. This legislation had caused a political storm. It famously legislated against raves, but it also extended the power of the police to stop protests. And within the same section of the law that was addressing public order problems, it increased police powers to evict gypsies and travellers from land. Gypsies and travellers' ways of living had been criminalised. The impact of public order legislation that culminated in the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 is still being felt by gypsies and travellers across England and Wales. And despite the fact that research, including my own, has shown that its draconian measures cause significant harm to gypsies and travellers, as well as increasing community tensions between them and other people, we now find ourselves in a position where the current Home Secretary is pushing a new piece of legislation through Parliament that extends those powers. More on that later. After my degree, and having worked at the Home Office during that time and subsequently, I reached a point where decisions about my future needed to be made. I'd had a fantastic time working in research, and again had made lifelong friends there, including my friend Jude, who has served as an inspiration personally and professionally ever since. Sorry. I'd had my son Rex, who's over there, and my priorities had changed. I'd previously flirted with the idea of doing a PhD, but I was determined not to chase funding as I'd seen friends do, and to suffer eternal disappointment. So I decided that doing a master's degree would be interesting and flexible. And on that note, I went back to the University of Surrey to find out whether that was possible and what it might involve. That visit to Surrey was fortuitous. Instead of signing up for an MSc, I was invited to do my PhD within their university scholarship scheme. My PhD supervisor was Professor Nigel Fielding, an incredible sociologist and much revered ethnographer, the method of research that requires you to embed yourself within your subject. I was so lucky to have this opportunity, and I grabbed it with both hands. My PhD examined the impact of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 on the policing of new travellers. That research evidenced the over-policing of new travellers in many ways. If you over-police people, that means you focus more attention on them than is reasonable or acceptable. Over-policing doesn't make people feel safer. It actually increases their fears and increases community tensions. My PhD specifically identified that the police used various tactics to disrupt, destabilise and spatially exclude new travellers that were both within and beyond the meaning and intent of the law. 2 years into my PhD, a lectureship post came up at Plymouth University, as it was at the time. I took a punt and applied. I thought it would be great to bring up Rex in the West Country, nearer to my mum. I got the job and we upped sticks and moved from Surrey to Devon. Okay. I remember arriving at the university on my first day, 1st of February 1999. I was given a key to my office, but nobody told me what I was supposed to do. Being an academic is something of an art form. As time went on, I realised I would spend most of my time teaching and marking and fitting my PhD in around the edges. Now the job of an academic is far more onerous and complex. There was no form filling in those days, no digital learning environments, key performance indicators, or convoluted processes to go through to engage with colleagues. I have so much respect for my early career colleagues who juggle now far greater pressures than I ever had to. Life happens, and I rode out the complexities of everyday life with the incredible support of friends and family, many of whom are here now. My son blossomed, and my PhD eventually got finished, and I published my work for the first time very happily in the British Journal of Criminology. I got into the role of lecturer, embraced it, and began doing postdoctoral research. Again, trying to understand how policing happens and why the new travellers were treated so badly by the police. At this point in my career, I had the opportunity of meeting and working with Rebecca Southern, who I have worked with ever since and I count among my closest of friends. Rebecca introduced me to evaluation research, and we completed an assessment of Gypsies and Travellers' accommodation needs Gypsies and Travellers' accommodation needs in Devon together in 2006. This project meant another light went on in my head. Until this research, I'd focused my work on policing and the ill treatment of new travellers who were a diverse range of peoples who live nomadically for a variety of reasons, but most commonly because they had been pushed or pulled out of housing and found an opportunity to live relatively safely as part of a wider community. I was aware of the differences between new travellers, Romany Gypsies, and Irish travellers, and their commonalities, and particularly the racism that Romany Gypsies and Irish travellers experienced, but I was not aware of how this played out in real terms. When Rebecca and I did the 2006 Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Needs Assessment, I learned more about how legislation and policy in the post-war period had closed off the traditional stopping grounds on common land that Gypsies and travellers had used for centuries. Then, to add insult to injury, despite the fact that the legislation had required local authorities to provide new stopping places for them, very few were actually created, nor have they ever been. This failure to provide stopping places essentially meant the assimilation of Gypsies and travellers into housing, which Becky Taylor has referred to house death for those communities. While today many Gypsies and travellers live in houses, many would prefer to live on sites or continue to do so. The circumstances created for Gypsies and travellers in the second half of the 20th century, the removal of their traditional stopping places, and the failure to subsequently provide spaces for them, combined with racist attitudes towards them, was bad enough. Then the public order legislation punished them for stopping and staying in the only places they could find. As one Irish traveller in my research said, "I'm not allowed to live anywhere. I feel looked down on by everyone." Gypsies and travellers from all their diverse communities were pushed into a corner, marginalised, demonised and problematised. And so the romantic myth was crystallised that the only legitimate or real gypsies were those who lived in horse-drawn wagons, who conformed to stereotypical pre-modern styles of living with the land. In real terms, however, even those gypsies or travellers who did live according to some of those stereotypes were not protected by them. I recently interviewed an amazing woman who told me of her time travelling with a horse-drawn wagon and living in traditional bender tents. She and her young family were abused and shouted at when on the road. And they received even worse treatment when stopping overnight on green lanes. So she said, "So we got shot at when we were horse-drawn. That happened quite a few times by farmers, actually pellets raining down. They'd either shoot over you so the pellets rained down. They actually shot through the bender tops at one point when the kids were inside." The ill treatment of gypsies and travellers found in the Devon Accommodation Needs Assessment was extensive. The failure to effectively accommodate gypsies and travellers and racism towards them has meant that gypsies and travellers have the worst outcomes of any minoritised community in the UK. Their access to education, as already mentioned, is mired by problems. Likewise, in health and welfare, their engagement with and by support services is highly problematic. One project I completed found that the joined-up approach of contemporary multi-agency working actually meant that the police and social services were colluding to interrogate the lives of gypsies and travellers and threaten their family units on the basis of their insecure accommodation. In other words, they were taking their kids away. The fear evidenced by gypsies and travellers has led them to be private and protective, often to the point that people hide their identities for fear of the hateful treatment that they will experience if they state their heritage. Let me put this simply. Gypsies and travellers die younger, have more illness, live in worse conditions. Their children are more likely to die. They have the lowest education levels, elevated rates of mental illness and suicide, and appear to be disproportionately represented in the criminal justice process. Having realised the terrible circumstances gypsies and travellers found themselves in, and identified that those people have been targeted because of their identity, I realised that the emerging area of hate studies in the UK that had already been established in the US may be a space within which I could talk about this. And so began the next part of my academic development. Hate studies, despite its horrendous research focus, is an academic space that is open, welcoming and collegiate. This is largely due to the people who work within this space, who have often been personally marked by the vagaries of hate or spend significant amounts of their time talking to people who have. Barbara Perry is the Grand Dame, to whom we are all grateful for connecting us. And I have to shout out to the wonderful Mark Walters and Jennifer Schwepp, who are amazing scholars and fabulous friends. I have worked with the International Network for Hate Studies now for many years, and I am privileged to currently be serving as its co-director alongside Jennifer. Hate Studies has been a space within which I've shared my work with gypsies, travellers, and increasingly Roma who have settled in the UK more recently. The diversity of those communities and the breadth of their experiences of hate has troubled me immensely. In one small piece of research I completed in 2015, I found that the 79 people I spoke to told me of in excess of 225 hate incidents and crimes they had experienced in the last few years. And these were those they remembered to mention, that they remembered to write down. Other studies have likewise evidenced hate. Research completed by the Traveller Movement in 2016 found that gypsies and travellers had been physically attacked and had their homes and cars burnt out or vandalised. Likewise, research by Greenfields in 2010 identified similarly extreme tactics as well as hateful speech and discrimination against Gypsies and travellers. It has been clear from my research that the hate Gypsies, travellers and Roma experience cannot simply be encapsulated as crimes or incidents, which is the framing for hate crimes within policy and legislation. When Gypsies and travellers talk about their experiences of hate, they see the discrimination they experience as part of that hatred, as well as the numerous microaggressions they meet in everyday life. So all aspects of their lives are marked by hateful attitudes and behaviours towards them. This has a direct impact on their lived experience, how they see themselves, their communities, and the people they interact with. In my small 2015 study, Gypsies and travellers I interviewed said, school said they had a vacancy for our youngest daughter until I said where we lived and was told that they didn't have any space anymore. When I deal with any kind of office, they reject me, turn me down. I was told by a policeman that people like us should be put up against a wall and shot, as there was no place for people like us in society. I found in that research that 81% of respondents had experienced name-calling on the basis of their identity, and 71% had said they had been bullied. Nearly 30% spoke of a range of other incidents, including threats and intimidation, sexualised intimidation, harassment, discrimination, unwanted photography and filming. And overall, that research found that few Gypsies or travellers were prepared to report these things to the police or any other organisation, despite the severity of the incidents they had experienced. That failure to report these things doesn't only mean that the perpetrators won't be held to account. It also means that the support mechanisms that kick in when a report is made don't happen. Victims are left without support, guidance, or help. The breakdown of trust between Gypsies, travellers and Roma and the police, as well as other agencies, also means that other issues that may arise within those communities are not effectively dealt with either. I've been much privileged by working with amazing people over the years. And one of those people is Katie McBride, who's over there. I taught Katie as an undergraduate, and we initially worked together when she was the Gypsy and Traveller Liaison Officer for Devon during the 2006 accommodation assessment that Rebecca and I completed. Subsequently, Katie went on to run an equalities organisation in the Southwest, and I eventually persuaded her to do a PhD in hate studies. Katie's now a lecturer at the university and a much valued friend. During our work within hate studies in recent years, Katie working with trans communities and I working with Gypsies, travellers and Roma, we realised that there was a gap in our ability to explain why the communities we were working with continued to experience so much hate in a contemporary society that apparently embraced difference and human rights. As I've already described above, we knew that prejudice was manifesting itself in multiple ways, through physical and verbal violence, through the systems of social life, in education, welfare provision, criminal justice, etc., and through the microaggressions, such as experiencing casual use of racist language, negative attitudes, and being ignored. What bothered Katie and I was how all these things related to each other. And so we turned to our clever colleagues, Oliver Smith and Tom Raymond, who are at Plymouth, and their work that allowed us to look at how our world works through a different lens. In doing so, Katie and I developed critical hate studies, in which we argue that hatefulness has been integrated into the accepted norms and values of the world that we live in today, which places individualism, competition, and consumerism at the heart of what it is to be a valuable person. We have suggested that when we feel insecure, lost, and angry in this new social landscape, instead of questioning how the world works, which is admittedly a massive task, we scapegoat others whom a racist society has placed beyond us. That scapegoating sometimes manifests in extreme ways. So some people turn to hideous ideologies, as we've seen with the rise of the far right. However, none of us are immune to the feelings of anxiety that the 21st century has engendered. And in the fight for a sense of belonging, we are all looking for something that will appease our insecurities. Consumerism doesn't make us feel better. We are at once fearful of Gypsies, travellers and Roma, who seem to want to live in ways that we don't understand, and at the same time, we are jealous of their apparent freedoms. The outcomes of our fears and jealousies are hateful acts. So we accept legislation that destroys the lives of Gypsies and travellers, falling for the lies peddled by a malignant media that they are responsible for their own fate. We turn a blind eye to anti-Gypsyism. We accuse Gypsies, travellers and Roma of leaving rubbish, being in the wrong place and not paying their taxes. In the meantime, we don't follow the very rules we use to demonise Gypsies, travellers and Roma. We leave our rubbish on the streets and in the countryside. Big business builds out-of-town malls that we shop in while city centres collapse. And tax avoidance is considered legitimate, whether you're a banker or a plumber, whether it's cash in hand work or work via a shell company, the goal is the same. It is easier to scapegoat than to realise that we are all living in a contemporary society that is broken, and we need to make change happen. So, I've reached a point in my career where I feel I can see where problems are coming from and how they manifest. I would argue that I can explain them to some degree, but finding solutions to them is so much harder. The main thing I've learned in my work in recent years has been that we need to reignite our imaginations so that we can find some answers. We need to be prepared to challenge our preconceived ideas. For Gypsies, travellers and Roma, this means we have to shift the narrative on a range of issues within legislation and policy, within organisations, and within our own homes and lives. The current Home Secretary, Priti Patel, put forward a new piece of legislation in 2021, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. This legislation further enhances measures to evict Gypsies and travellers from land and prevents them from returning to places from where they've previously been evicted. The legislation is applicable to anyone over the age of 18 with as little as one vehicle and who may be likely to cause damage, disruption, or distress. Such terms are extremely loose. How can it be predicted what a person may be likely to do? Indeed, when anti-Gypsyism is so widespread in our society, it's highly likely that the presence of Gypsies and travellers in an area may cause distress. This legislation does nothing to address the fact that Gypsies and travellers have nowhere to stop or stay. And so I hear voices. They are travellers. They should move on. Even those Gypsies and travellers who choose to be mobile need somewhere to stop and stay on overnight, for a few days, while working in a particular area, or while their children are educated. And some people just want to stay in the same place over a long period of time. They just don't want to live in a house. Even the police, who have not been shy of evicting Gypsies and travellers, have made it clear to the Home Secretary that the new law is unworkable. So when you think about it from an informed perspective, and as I mentioned earlier, use your imagination in partnership with existing knowledge, creating legislation that prevents Gypsies and travellers stopping in places is illogical and won't work. What we need is more legitimate places for gypsies and travellers to stop and stay on. The provision of those spaces that were promised in the mid-20th century would immediately reduce community tensions. I mean, the police weren't wasting their time policing communities as if they were offenders, and victimised people could begin accessing the support and services they deserve. Kids could attend school, health services be accessed, needs met. Of course, that doesn't resolve everything, but it would certainly be a start. Relationships could be built and racism within organisations challenged. People I talk to often say to me, the problems are too big, too insurmountable, set in stone. Evidently, that's not the case. We need to change the narrative. However, consumer society is a very effective analgesic. It mollifies us, takes away our pains for long enough that we accept the status quo. But we can all make a difference, even if that is simply by calling people out. My favourite riposte to anti-traveller hate speech online was when my brilliant partner, Adi, who's just there, responded to a Facebook post about travellers moving into the local area and leaving rubbish. He simply posted a picture of a rubbish-strewn beach after bank holiday weekend. Well posted, my love. Next time you see a gypsy or traveller site in a place that may not seem quite right, remember those people have been forced into those places and likely have nowhere else to go. Next time you hear someone use a racist term against a gypsy or traveller, don't simply accept it, and if you can, challenge it. If you hear of a crime committed by gypsies or travellers, don't connect their offending to their ethnicity or their heritage, and don't extrapolate to assume that all gypsies and travellers are offenders. Don't fall into the trap of believing everything you see in the media. I regularly get asked questions about gypsy, traveller and Roma cultures that are based on things seen on television programmes. I don't want to shock you, but you need to realise those programmes are made for entertainment. They very rarely represent reality. My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding is no more representative of gypsy and traveller communities than The Only Way is Essex is representative of people from Essex. And remember, people who are treated badly may not respond well. They may not trust people they don't know. They may be angry at the way they have been treated and the ways their families have been treated. They are as scared as you are. Meanwhile, we need to protect academic freedom so that time and energy can be spent for us to identify effective, big solutions to the problems we face in society as a whole. And so, here I find myself. I've spent my career thus far at Plymouth. And while arguably I could have progressed faster by moving to other universities, I've been very happy here and found great support, collegiality and academic growth in this space. Many of us come to Plymouth and stay, most likely because of the proximity of the beach. However, that longevity has ensured that criminology has strong bones. As Dan mentioned, he was on my interview panel. He's been a great colleague, and lately, as my boss, allowed me to spread my academic wings, for which I'm very grateful. In recent years, since developing critical hate studies with Katie, I've been more prolific in my work and outputs. I'm proud that my work has been published in excellent journals and edited collections, and I've recently published my book on the harms of hate against gypsies and travellers in the Palgrave Hate Studies series. I've also attained research funding with much patient support from our administrative teams in the university. I'm a privileged person who has been able to ride out the pandemic by sitting in my home office and writing, supported by AD, who also baked delicious bread and made me feel safe and secure. When I look over my career and occasionally glance my eyes over the content of old papers, I realise how easy it is to forget to move forward and question ourselves, our ideas, and our ways of understanding what is going on around us. We forget that our job is to progress knowledge, to be innovative, to be open-minded and prepared to change our views. In 2015, myself and the beautiful Leslie Simmons, who's been with me throughout my academic and personal journey, successfully bid for the British Society of Criminology conference held at Plymouth. That conference was titled Criminology, Voyages of Critical Discovery. Perhaps that conference title sums up my career so far at Plymouth. The conference was titled, I did so well. It's been a fascinating journey, one with pitfalls, times when I haven't been able to think straight or been able to write, times where the academic enterprise has left me wanting. Throughout this time, the thing that has kept me going has been the need to shout out about injustice, to stand alongside Gypsies, travellers and Roma, to challenge racism, prejudice and discrimination. When you think about it, the resilience of Gypsies, travellers and Roma to hold on to their cultures is remarkable. The decimation of Roma people across mainland Europe in the Nazi Parajmos, or what we refer to as the Holocaust, has not prevented them from standing together. The poverty and exclusion they have experienced as a consequence of ongoing racism has not prevented them from having pride in their cultures. In the UK, attempts at assimilation have not forced Gypsies and travellers to abandon their communities or ways of living. Currently, I have the great fortune to be working with on a national research project with Coretta Phillips and Becky Taylor that is exploring Gypsies and travellers' experiences of crime and justice since the 1960s. I'm also part of a European consortium that is funding research into hate, which employs my fabulous Roma PhD student who is examining how hate manifests against Roma in the UK, Spain and Romania. I have absolutely no doubt that he will soon supplant me as an expert in this area. These projects have great capacity, or greater capacity than any I've done before, to ensure that Gypsy, traveller and Roma voices can come to the fore, and I'm extremely proud to be working on them. I'm looking forward to challenging my thinking further through this work in the next stage of my career. So to end where I started, with you. My career thus far is evidently not down to me, but to those people I have had around me who have helped me along the way and supported me to embrace new ideas and new problems. Allowing that girl with a bad attitude to use her defiance as a woman, to challenge prejudice, attain legitimacy, and hopefully shift perceptions of who we value in our society. In my spare time, I love to walk the coast path with my lovely friend Emma. We embrace the beauty of the coast. We talk, or I do mostly. We eulogise about what we would like to see the world become. On those days, we truly know what it is to be content. What I have realised through my work, talking to Gypsies, travellers and Roma, my colleagues, my friends and my family, is that we all simply want the opportunity to flourish, to find some contentment in our lives. To that end, we need to stop talking about rights in terms of what we should not experience, but what we should experience. We need to stop talking about what we have and focus on more on who we can be. Gypsies, travellers and Roma have a right to flourish, as do we all. Thank you.
You're amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, my job is to ask you questions, like I haven't done. I've been told to do here, but not too close. Don't look at me. So I'm going to ask you some questions, not my own. I've asked you enough over the last 20 years. So I wonder if the amazing events team would put the Slido details back up again, though, so that people in the room can catch them again if they want to add some questions. That'd be great. But I'll start off with what we've got on Slido. So start off with a generally easy one. Can you talk more about whether the policing of Gypsies, Roma and travellers has contributed to or alleviated the problems that these communities face?
Okay, so absolutely they have contributed to the problems that Gypsies, travellers and Roma face. Now, there's a great academic that Dan and I know, Gordon Hughes, and I remember sitting in the pub with Gordon and him, not that we go to the pub much, and him saying it's really important to note the good things, okay? So I would first of all say there are good things. There are some amazing coppers out there. There's an amazing ex-copper in the room. There are some good people out there that are doing some great work, and often the liaison officers who have been really well trained in diversity, understanding different communities, they do brilliant work. But unfortunately, that doesn't seep into the wider community of policing. And it doesn't necessarily seep into the multiple agencies who work with police. And it certainly doesn't seep into the private security personnel who work with police. So there are multiple problems with policing, and we try and do training with policing, but the whole point of the police is that the police represent us. They are citizens in uniform, and therefore they can be subject to the same prejudices, etc. we have. And the acceptable nature of prejudice towards Gypsies, travellers and Roma means that that is part of those communities. And as that, I mean, I do use that quote quite a bit in my work, where that person, that traveller said to me, you know, a police officer told them that they'd like to put them up against a wall and shoot them because there's no place for them. You know, that's a police officer. That's supposed to be the person you go to for help, you know? So yeah, sorry, they do contribute, but there are some good ones out there.
There's another question that kind of leads us into maybe more of a discussion around our theoretical position. It's all right, you can start easy. It's asking, though, what individuals can do on a day-to-day basis to help with some of these concerns and what you know.
Yeah. So when I was writing this, I was really trying to make sure that I was giving something people can do. And I think that one of the main things is that casual racism towards Gypsies, travellers and Roma. It's this really acceptable racism. You hear it all the time. And it's just not being that person yourself. But also, if anyone you know that you're close to is using, you know, racist language or terminology, even if you're not sure, you know, if you're not sure, maybe don't use that word. Yeah, you know, it's about thinking about those things, but it's also about, you know, when we have at the moment, there are local council elections going on all over the place. The local authorities are really powerful. They do huge amounts of work, which is very good, and huge amounts of work, which is very challenging. And accommodating Gypsies and travellers is not seen as politically popular. So we've seen it happen in Plymouth, where there's been a space found for a Gypsy and traveller site. Fantastic. It's all gone through the process, and then suddenly an election's looming and it falls off the table because no one wants to be that person that says they'll stand up for Gypsies and travellers. And it's shocking. It's just racism. It's really problematic. So, yeah, there are lots of things you can do. You can think about who you vote for. You can think about, you know, but on a local through to a national level, you can actually, you know, just think about these prejudices that people are stating. That whole thing about rubbish, you know, is so frustrating. Yeah, I could go on. And also, I should note that in our research, the research I did with Katie, and subsequent research, we've found consistently that there are high levels of fly tipping on Gypsies and travellers' sites. So that rubbish may not actually have been left by those people. There's loads of dumping on those sites, and it's shocking. I'm going on one now.
No, it's all right. I don't want to stop you. This is your moment to go on one. You go on one. What about, so there's a question that's about how we conflate and how we take the discussion beyond racism. So what do you want to say about separating out? Because obviously you've talked about how your research started with new travellers, and you've explored how racism impacts on people's lives, but racism is framed in a certain way within policy. So do you want to expand a bit about how your work kind of gets into how that's different?
Okay. I think what racism is embedded into all aspects of our everyday lives. You know, it's a complex topic, but it's actually quite a simple topic. You know, we are where we are essentially because of colonialism and how colonialism developed over time, and therefore racism is integrated into our everyday lives. But there is a problem nowadays with the fact that it's very fashionable. This sounds terrible, maybe. I don't think it does. It depends what I'm going to say, I suppose. There's a bit of a fashion to go, oh, we'll fund something if it addresses racism. And there needs to be thought behind that. There needs to be careful thought. Yes, brilliant. We need more research on racism. We need more research that explores racism. We need more issues tackling racism. But we need to do that properly, and we need to talk to people from different communities to do that well. Not just think as white, privileged people that we know what we're doing. You know, that's not our job. Our job is to go out there and talk to people. So that's, you know, really important, I'd say. But also we need to acknowledge, so people will say, oh, you know, this whole racism thing, you know, white people can't do anything right nowadays. Well, you know, you've been getting away with a lot for a long time. Kind of get over it. You know, deal with the fact that there are going to be other people that are coming up. People of colour have a right to that space. It's not yours to give away. It's theirs as well as yours. So I think that's really important. People also talk about, well, you know, for example, we've got a deputy, vice president in America, who's a black woman. Oh, well, there can't be any racism, can there? Of course there's racism, you know. Individualist society, competitive individualism, the society we live in, does allow some people to kick through, find their way through the systems. But that doesn't mean that racism has disappeared. And actually, it serves the purpose of this contemporary society to let some of those people through, to make it look like it's working. But actually, it's not. And it's not addressing the real problems. So our work is about acknowledging some of those contemporary forces at play and how the relationships of power have shifted. So the power doesn't necessarily sit within the state. The power sits within Google, for example.
Twitter, watch out. Hello, yes, would you like, go on. Sure, no worries.
So, I'm trying to speak loudly in the camera.
That's all right, I'll repeat it, don't worry, you go.
Okay. The question would be, that you have to bear with me, is that here, what is a gypsy? Because having known lots of friends with different communities, because we all know that Gypsy, Roma, New Age and Irish are actually partners on war with each other, which doesn't help. Now, the thing that's most interesting is the friend of mine in Roma considers the word gypsy a racist comment, which, well, the basis of that is that people mistakenly thought they were from Egypt and then dropped the E and came up with gypsy.
So let me just, oh, sorry, go on.
On the same table, you've got Roman Roman citizens, so that doesn't really help matters either. But the thing that I find the catalyst of this is that these days, with the song, regulatory gypsios, it's actually popularised. It seems as a good sense. The word has been completely reclaimed. So, is the term actually racist or not? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's not really seems to be.
Thank you. So I'll try and sum. So there's a question that's raising that there are tensions between different communities within the Gypsy Roma traveller kind of umbrella term that we tend to kind of bunch people into, and asking the question about the origins of the word gypsy itself and whether that in itself could be considered a racist terminology. So the overarching question is, what is a gypsy?
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm so I can answer those questions. Okay, so, no, brilliantly, no, it's absolutely fine. All questions are good questions. And it's a really important question because in mainland Europe, it would not be appropriate to use the word gypsy or traveller. It's only appropriate to use the word Roma to represent the very varied and diverse communities who come under Roma banner. However, in the UK, many Romany gypsies and Irish travellers claim that name, and therefore I use all three as advisedly on the basis of that's what I've been asked to do. But gypsy can be perceived as offensive, but many people, the majority of Romany gypsies that I've spoken to over many years have said, I'm a gypsy and I'm proud to be a gypsy. So I go with that, but more broadly in mainland Europe and increasingly in the UK to some degree, Roma is used as a term. So you're right. You know, it's a complicated thing. But what I try to do, I'm not supposed to touch that microphone. What I try to do is represent what people have told me. And so that's what I do. So there are two other things that come out of that. One of them is that, of course, there's conflict between the different communities. If you push people into a corner, and if you treat people really badly and give them barely any resources, they are going to be frustrated and look to each other for the pains. You know, this is meant for me. No, it's meant for you. You know, if you've only got one chair and two people, they're going to fight over it. And that's the circumstances you find yourselves in. And heritage of gypsies and travellers and Roma is really, really complex and very diverse. And I'm not a historian. Becky Taylor has written brilliant work in this area. And in Romany studies, there are multiple pieces of work that talk about the histories of gypsies, travellers and Roma across Europe. So they're really important things. Was there anything else that I was thinking of from there? There was something else, but I can't remember what the other thing was.
Thank you. I was going to ask about kind of how nomadism is different to the racial categorisation of the groups that you research with, and the importance of understanding how nomadism is understood by communities and misunderstood.
Okay. So nomadism is really interesting. So we think about nomadism in our kind of on our sofas watching the TV, and we watch Bedouin nomads go across the sand dunes or whatever. And we have this really romantic notion of what nomadism means. Nomadism is really complicated, and it isn't simply mobility. It's not simply moving around. The nomadic culture of gypsies, travellers and Roma tends to associate much more with cultural ways of living and thinking about the world rather than necessarily movement. So there's a whole thing sort of about cultural nomadism. But we tend to, and Rebecca Southern and I have written a paper about this, and about the fact that, I've just remembered the other thing, about the fact that this conflation of nomadism with mobility is really problematic, because what it does is exactly as I was saying earlier, well, they're travellers, why don't they travel? It's just ridiculous. It's not about mobility. It's about culture, and it's about acknowledging that people who move need to stop and stay. And Peter Kabachnik talks about gypsies and travellers as place invaders. They're treated like they're invading spaces, because in sedentary society, we've created all this striation. We block everything off. We shut everything down. That's not how gypsies, travellers and Roma think. That's not the culture of gypsies, travellers and Roma. And the thing I just thought of in terms of sort of race and ethnicity was that it troubles me greatly. I happen to have written another paper about this. That we constantly conflate Gypsies, travellers and Roma into this lump, as if they're not multiple and diverse communities with different heritages, different stories, etc. And it particularly troubles me around some of the work recently that's been done where Roma who have come from mainland Europe to the UK are being placed within the same space as Gypsies and travellers, because many Roma, I don't know any Roma who want to live on a site or in a caravan. They want to live in a house, obviously. Whereas Gypsies and travellers often, not always, but often want to live on a site or on the move. And so it troubles me, this conflation in it. It smacks to me of racism. It's like, well, let's shove them all together. They're the problem people. Let's put them over there. But no, actually, they're very different people. We need to acknowledge their commonalities, because there are commonalities around ethnicity, culture. But we need to not just push people into a box and put them in the corner. And just really, that's the thing. Thank you.
Because you didn't say it out loud. There's a collection of questions here that's kind of on a similar theme, so let me try and kind of sum them together. So a few questions around somebody saying how wonderful we are, a couple of people saying that.
Not surprised you're like Katie.
It wasn't me. How do you see the role of activists increasing harm and discrimination for travellers and Gypsies? And I know it's difficult, I'm sorry, I said it though. And it's not me who asked it. There's a couple on that kind of theme. So somebody else asking around, what's the place of work to counter anti-Gypsyism in wider anti-racism movements? So kind of it's the critical edge of our work.
Yeah. So it's that thing of, so there's a hierarchy of legitimacy, as I talked about. There's this myth that, the only legitimate Roma people or Gypsies in this country particularly are Romani Gypsies that conform to a particular way of living. That, maybe some people do, but, they're very diverse communities. I've forgotten already where I'm going with that. The hierarchy of legitimacy. So because resources are so limited and the problem is so big, so you have so many people being treated ill, suffering exclusion, suffering marginalisation, being victimised, but very few resources available. That means that, those resources are being fought over. And that's really, really problematic. And it can be enhanced by people that are trying to do good. So people who are really trying to do something good, so activist organisations, sometimes don't realise that they're making that situation worse, sort of by fighting over the resources in the way that they do. It's not their fault, actually. They're only trying to do something good. But it can be problematic. And it can enhance the hierarchy. And the problem that we have is in legislation, Gypsies and travellers are defined differently. So according to planning legislation, there has to be an element of mobility in your status. And that's what makes you a Gypsy or traveller. Whereas according to race relations legislation, if you're a Romani Gypsy or an Irish traveller, your ethnicity is obviously protected. But you could be a Romani Gypsy, and if you haven't moved from a site for a particularly a long period of time, then according to planning law, you're no longer a Gypsy or traveller, which is just ridiculous. So the legislation itself is, presents a paradox. It doesn't define correctly. And so people sort of, get trapped in that and get trapped in this kind of desire to attain legitimacy. So I'll often interview people and they'll say, well, my mum was this and my dad was that. And I'm like, you are who you are. I don't need you to give me your family history to have legitimacy. If you want to tell me about it, because it's fascinating, that's brilliant. And you have pride in it, that's fantastic. But it shouldn't be something you need to be able to legitimise who you are. And that's hugely problematic. So, yeah. And in terms of activist organisations do amazing things. In Central Europe, if it wasn't for the activist organisations, if it wasn't for the work on the ground, the situation would be terrible. And there are some wonderful European-wide organisations. The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe does fantastic work that really calls out prejudice and really calls out, racism. So, it both happens.
I think it kind of refers back to our wider point about the system change that's needed. People doing good within a system that's broken is still causing problems. Exactly.
You said that really well, Katie.
I learned from the best. So I've got an anonymous, but he's telling us who he is. Mark sat in Brighton crying. So, blubbing through your amazing lecture and feeling so incredibly proud of my friend and colleague. So I'm not trying to make you cry. I'm going to ask a question. Throughout your varied career, what has kept you motivated to keep researching and to fight what often seems like a losing battle?
It's a brilliant question, Mark, and I love you dearly. As I said, I think I get it off my mum, like this kind of reticence, like, stop it, I kind of really feel that sense of injustice. I don't like it, and I'm not happy with it. And change isn't happening. And I think that's why our work's been so important to me, because I was feeling a bit like, oh, this is pointless. And then we worked together and I suddenly realised, actually, we just need to look through a side door. We need to start looking at how we communicate within this contemporary society and recognise the forces upon us. And that's been really, really inspiring. I'd say this has been probably the most exciting part of my career, is the last few years since we've been doing this together. So I think part of it has been that inspiration. Part of it is that a very, very senior academic in Romany studies, when I was doing my PhD, I was really excited to meet this person. And I sat down and I went, hi, I'm Zoë James. I'm doing my PhD on this. And he just looked at me and he went, many people do their PhDs, but very few people commit their life to it. Red rag. So there is a bit of that as well.
Like we can't go anywhere else after that. So thank you for your engaging talk on such a vitally important topic that receives too little attention. Can you talk more, just to go back again to some of the simpler definitions about kind of language and culture and how people differ and how we define and kind of frame people?
Okay.
In those kind of broad, we categorise everyone together.
Yeah.
What is it about people's culture and their differences?
Cultures that are different. It's not really for me to say. That's for Gypsies, Travellers and Roma to stand here and talk about their cultures. And there's loads of stuff that you can go and access about Gypsy and Traveller cultures and Roma cultures. There's wonderful organisations like the Romany Arts Company that's based in Wales. There's brilliant organisations like Traveller Space in Cornwall, Friends, Families and Travellers in Sussex, Leeds Gate in Leeds. I'm trying to remember. I mean, they're sort of activist organisations as well, and they're all brilliant. But there are lots of amazing creative outputs as well from those communities that really tell their story, which I think is really, really important. And we're actually going to be doing that in the research that I'm doing with Coretta and Becky. We're doing a series of oral histories with people from Gypsy and Traveller communities, and we're going to be creating some creative outputs. But there are lots of stories that people tell, books to read, websites to go to. So it's not really for me to define the boundaries of those communities, and I think they overlap. Becky's work on history and what happened in the post-war period when people had lost their homes, and the relationship between people living in less fixed accommodation, as well as Gypsies and Travellers, things like that. This is something that Ian and I have done this great work on, which we really enjoy and we need to write. And that's about this weird relationship between our fear and loathing of gypsies and travellers, and then we spend all our holidays in tiny little caravans on sites. It's like, oh, yeah, what's going on there? You know, and yeah, so we need to think, to bound things. I'm cautious to do that. I don't want to speak for other people if that's okay.
That's good signposting to people who know. I guess a final thing that kind of wraps up the selection of others that are here is about what's left to do. There's a question about, is there research around Gypsies, Romas and travellers' access to counselling service, for example, in this pandemic of mental health concerns that we're all living through? Yeah. What other kind of work do you see ahead of you, or indeed ahead of other people?
I think there's loads to do. I think we need to, all of us in our daily lives need to think about what we value and why we value those things. I think we need to look at the wider world that we live in, because we can't just look at the problems in our society without looking at those wider stories. We need to try and, think about the fact of, who is powerful, who's pulling our strings, who's telling us what to do. And racism happens within that context. I think we need to do that, all of us. We need to lift the blanket of neoliberal capitalism. So I think we all need to be doing that. But within that space, we need to be talking about, obviously, we need to not legislate against gypsies and travellers stopping and staying in places, and we need to accommodate gypsies and travellers. That is just ridiculous that we don't do that. So there are some really practical things that need to be done. But also, what I have found really interesting and what I love about having attained this position is that people are coming and asking me for help. So recently I worked with Lime Culture, which is a national organisation that supports people who have suffered from sexual violence. And I supported them in creating a policy document for their staff working with gypsy and traveller communities. And it was fantastic, gypsy, traveller and Roma communities, actually. And it was a fantastic opportunity because they'd written their policy document, but they didn't really know about the communities. And so I was able to go in and go through that document and go, you need to think about this, you need to think about that. And so working with people. So I think there's a really applied work that we can do, and working not just with gypsy and traveller organisations, but with wider organisations. You and I are currently doing training with Catch 22, which is the probation provider, I do know that, for the whole of the Southwest, and we've done training with them on inclusion for gypsies and travellers and Roma. And that training's been done in a model that is called the train-the-trainer model. So we're able to get people in that organisation invested in what they're doing so that they can then go and train their colleagues, rather than doing fly-in, fly-out training, which is always a little bit, box ticking. So that's been really good. So things like that I think we can do practically, but I think there are layers. I think we need to also challenge the wider social issues that we have around us and not be scared to. We're all a bit scared. We all feel a bit insecure, especially post-pandemic. I personally have really struggled with kind of coming back out in the world and feel a bit under pressure. It's also really sad because, there was that moment at the beginning of the pandemic where you thought, we could change the world. And then we're back at it on our phones, And it's a bit sad. So we need to be brave, I think.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Zoë James.
Thank you.
There are some refreshments and canapes, I think, waiting for us outside those doors. Sorry, people on Zoom. Open your own bottles. That's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.